Do you remember the Wayfair human trafficking scandal? In 2020, QAnon adherents and conspiracy theorists began spreading word that Wayfair, the furniture company, was trafficking small children because on their website, furniture had feminine names and was exorbitantly priced. Most of this is easily explained as Wayfair, like Amazon, uses stock and demand of its items to algorithmically change the prices on things. USA Today did a wonderful job debunking most of the conspiracy talking points in an article citing a plethora of sources I will put down below, but none of that stopped the conspiracy from spreading. This is one conspiracy theory I actually saw someone fall for in real life. A former acquaintance from high school who I was friends with on Facebook began sharing news articles that were trying to expose this conspiracy tied to alt-right and far-right movements like anti-vaxxers and QAnon. But the thing is, she didn't realize it. She wasn't very politically active, but she was a mom. She didn't know the broader implications of what she was sharing or how accurate it was. She just saw an attention-grabbing headline was affected by children being trafficked. She just wanted to keep spreading awareness, regardless of accuracy or validity. Now, what does this have to do with The Sound of Freedom, the recently released faith film based on the real-life exploits of Tim Ballard? The film, which released on July 4th, 2023, has become an indie hit of sorts, grossing $150 million-ish at time of making, bolstered by an ad campaign that encourages audiences to buy tickets so other audience members later might be able to see the film for free. The film has become a conservative rallying cry of sorts, championed by all sorts of right-wing commentators who have decried the woke left backlash, even as the film gets mostly positive reviews from critics, even from the left. Now, I want to be clear here. Human trafficking and the trafficking of children in sex slavery especially is a crime against humanity. It's the kind of evil that very few people can really grasp because the average person is so far insulated from it. Rightfully, most people are sickened by it, easily driven to anger by the idea that people will steal children and sell them like pieces of cattle to pedophiles. I can only imagine that feeling is exacerbated for parents. So, much like the Wayfair conspiracy, I can't blame anyone for having an emotional reaction to the film. And just like the Wayfair conspiracy, this entire film was a fabrication and doesn't serve anyone, least of all the victims of sex trafficking. Because The Sound of Freedom isn't based on a true story. It's based entirely on the lies of a man who has spent a decade chasing stardom. While the film tries to paint Tim Ballard as a saint-like protector of children drawn to his calling by God, the story of Ballard and Operation Underground Railroad is one that has repeatedly abandoned victims and placed trafficking victims in greater danger while raking in millions of dollars that no one can seem to track down. But to really dig into this film, we need to take it apart piece by piece. We'll be talking about the film's entire history, who's been associated with it, and most importantly, how it distorts the truth and aims to take advantage of a sympathetic audience to continue pilfering from generally well-meaning people, pilferage that goes towards many instances of worsening trafficking and endangering victims. In 2013, DHS agent Tim Ballard quit his job to pursue freelance work rescuing children internationally from sex slavery. Ballard, a lifelong Mormon with close ties to the LDS, received backing from Glenn Beck, a media has-been in the conservative space who is also Mormon, and he credits Beck with helping Operation Underground Railroad get started. Here's the real problem with going through the timeline. Ballard really likes to make himself sound heroic. Under most circumstances, I'd say that was even justifiable for somebody who's dedicated their lives to stopping pedophiles and ending sex slavery. However, there's ulterior motives at work here, as we will discuss later. Until then, just keep that in mind. And remember it whenever you read one of the many articles that recount his stories in his own words. Ballard worked at the DHS as a special agent for more than 12 years before quitting to form Operation OUR, or Operation Underground Railroad, which is described as a, quote, anti-trafficking nonprofit that assists law enforcement agencies. Which, so far, so good, right? I mean, most people shouldn't have a problem with a nonprofit that works to expose child predators and rescue kids, especially in underserved areas where trafficking and trafficking-related crimes are rampant, right? Well, there's a problem. Strong evidence indicates that Ballard has just lied and fabricated the stories of his daring child rescuing escapades, mostly to continue garnering donations for his ongoing adventures. Many speculate that this exaggeration and fabrication is so that Ballard can continue garnering donations for his companies. Note, I did say companies, because OUR is not the only organization Tim has worked on and profited from. No, there are a couple all spun off from OUR, but very few related to child trafficking, rehabilitation, or helping victims. Some, for example, are CrossFit gyms. Other efforts of Tim's include the Nazarene Fund, which is largely supported by Glenn Beck and claims to help victims of slavery across the Middle East and Asia. Beck, another member of the Mormon Church, once more, has deep ties to many of Tim's efforts. In fact, a lot of Mormons do. Like a Utah Attorney General.
Attorney General Sean Reyes serves on Operation Underground Railroad's advisory board and even went undercover with that sting in Colombia.
We
actually had no idea he was the Attorney General. He just acted humble like everyone else.
On Tuesday, he talked about the great work being done by OUR while receiving an award from Daughters of the American Revolution.
And even Angel Studios, the distributor of the film, is based in Utah. The stories Tim tells often turn out to be exaggerated or, even worse, outright lies. One example of the fabrication comes from one of the main inspirations for the film Sound of Freedom, the arrest of pedophile Earl Venton Buchanan in 2006. Let's hear from Tim how he recounts his story.
An American man was kidnapping children in Mexico, smuggling them into the United States. And in San Bernardino, you can look at this case up. His name's Earl Buchanan. You can look it up, you can Google, learn all about the case. He had a compound up in San Bernardino where he was taking the kids and he was filming his sex acts with these kids.
He was having sex with them and filming
it.
And then what, selling it online or?
Keeping it for himself, sharing it with people. And so this guy's coming across the border and we're on the scene and we get the kid out, this 5-year-old boy. And it was the moment that he ran.
5-year-old boy.
5-year-old boy.
Gosh.
And I recognized him from the video.
No way.
And I was like, oh my gosh, I've never seen one of the kids from the video. And I didn't know, I had a physiological reaction. Like I didn't know if I could handle this. And then the kid kind of inherently knew we were the good guys, right? So he runs to us and jumps in my arms.
No way.
And he's like he's holding me and he's shaking. And I'm just like, oh my gosh, does he speak English? Does he speak Spanish? Maybe both, I don't know. And he spoke perfect English, which was haunting to me because the only reason he did was because he had been with this guy, as it turned out, since he was taken as an infant.
Oh my gosh.
And he said to me, like no 5-year-old should ever have to say to anyone, he said, I don't belong here. And the pain was so severe for me because I could immediately multiply that statement by millions of kids.
The problem is, according to court receipts from the arrest and trial of Buchanan, this didn't happen. Agent Ballard arrived at the scene after. This is like his inciting incident. This is like if Batman lied about his parents dying. I will cite the source for this from the American Crime Journal down below. And then there are stories like Liliana's, who for years was touted as one of the people saved by Ballard and the crew, only to be revealed in court documents that she actually saved herself from her abuser. Liliana was 17 when she escaped in New York. In a Vice article titled "A Famed Anti-Sex Trafficking Org Has an Issue with the Truth," Tim tells a different story during a publicity appearance. Quote, not long ago, a 13-year-old girl from Central America, let's call her Liliana, was kidnapped from her village, then trafficked into the US at a location where there was no wall or barrier. From there, she was taken to New York City, where she was by American men 30 to 40 times a day. The private anti-trafficking organization I founded over 5 years ago, Operation Underground Railroad, eventually helped Liliana escape her hell. Ballard then used this same rhetoric again, lowering Liliana's age to 11 for a speech he gave at the White House just a few days after this quote. He continued to use her story in interviews and even Senate testimony, always using it as justification for a border wall, despite the fact that she was being abused even before arriving here. And as Vice notes, there's no traces that OUR had anything to do with her rescue. The Vice article does a wonderful write-up, and you should read it because there are way too many lies and inconsistencies to list here. I've supplied links below to 2 incredible articles from the reporters at Vice who absolutely dismantle Tim's lies about his heroism. And heroism is the point, make no mistake. OUR leans very heavily into the idea of near vigilantism, though still likes to tout close ties to law enforcement. Those usually are also lies. The reality is there are plenty of law enforcement agencies who OUR says they're tied to, who in response for comment from Vice just kind of went, nuh-uh. Some law enforcement agencies have severed ties with the group, such as Washington State law enforcement following the Operation Net Nanny stings, which were funded in part by OUR, and reportedly used tactics such as entrapment, evidenced by someone who was caught in a sting and then smeared publicly by OUR as a pedophile. The problem, the sting was set up and proven in court to be an arrangement for one legal adult man and another legal adult woman to meet for consensual kink play. The man sued and won, rightfully. Ballard likes to tout OUR's use of intelligence and well-trained operatives for its trafficking efforts. Neither of these are true. What is true is that Ballard never misses the spotlight and never misses a chance to film himself on one of his raids. In a Vice article titled "Inside a Massive Anti-Trafficking Charity's Blundering Overseas Missions," 2 OUR workers give an account on a raid that found nothing. But Ballard himself showed up accompanied by a camera crew and on a hunch from a psychic detective from Utah. It should also be noted that according to someone who knew Ballard and followed him on a 2014 jump, or what they call operations, Ballard had openly been hoping to turn the footage he was gathering into a TV series, in addition to promotional material that over the years has helped him garner donations. Despite touting that they work with former military and CIA, OUR's operators are usually poorly trained, tactically unaware, and former military members who have left the organization have expressed disgust at the lack of training and knowledge displayed during OUR operations. All of these first-hand testimonies are documented in those Vice articles. I recommend you read them. But to me, all of that pales in comparison to how OUR's efforts have likely worsened the lives of trafficking victims after they leave an area. Operators would ask pimps for young girls to find kids being trafficked, something that the article notes could cause demand for those pimps going out and trafficking new victims to meet that demand. They would impersonate and follow doctors, something recreated in the movie, which could lead to driving distrust of actual doctors in places in desperate need of medical care, like doctors trying to treat vulnerable communities to stem obscure diseases from causing outbreaks that can reach a big population. In one article by a former associate of Ballard, Meg Conley recounts joining an operation in 2014. Tim had traffickers bring 26 children to a house under the guise of buying them. This is similar to how a sting plays out in the film as well, and plays heavily into the idea that OUR's efforts actually make trafficking worse. By her account, that day was revealed to be the first day that 2 of those children had been trafficked at all. After Tim and his team left, all 26 of the children were later released because the Dominican authorities had no way to care for them. And you might ask, but what about the money they raised? There's little to no evidence what the donations are actually used for, and Tim has done his best to keep it close to the vest when questioned, saying that the secrecy is to protect survivors. But based on previous accounts and exploits, it doesn't seem like a lot of it goes to actually helping people get normal lives. Again, the details are posted below. Read the damn Vice articles. Give them to your parents. See, the thing is, Tim doesn't actually care about who he hurts, demonstrably. He may care about children in the abstract, but he doesn't care about the victims left in his wake. He loves the spotlight. He loves being seen as a hero. It's honestly sickening. Here's a painting that was actually on sale, by the way, depicting him as the leader of a new underground railroad, with Harriet Tubman and Abraham Lincoln cheering him on. He's been the focus of other documentaries that have been criticized for their simplistic black and white portrayal of Ballard's heroics. Oh, and speaking of merch, it's a big part of how OUR presents its mission, by the way. Like this hat OUR put branded with Find Gardy, a young boy who Ballard has continued to name drop at fundraising events for almost a decade now. And remember when I mentioned other companies earlier? Yeah, Tim has expanded OUR into a proper empire to support, as evidenced by this picture of a whiteboard written by Tim showing how all of the proceeds funnel into the organization, detailing even how profits from businesses like his gym and donations funnel to his personally branded website. OUR, meanwhile, has brought in more than $20 million a year, including from high-powered backers like Glenn Beck, funding Tim's excursions around the world for photo ops that endanger sex trafficking victims and potentially cause civil unrest. Ballard recently departed OUR shortly before The Sound of Freedom was released. Almost immediately, he set up a new website for something called the Spear Fund, taking care to mention that it's related to the popular film The Sound of Freedom, for the SEO, you know. What is the Spear Fund? What is it taking donations for? It doesn't say, but you can give your money, because Tim will always take your money. In the wake of the film and Ballard's departure, OUR has put out a fun little article detailing which parts of the film are fictionalized. Now, to someone without all the previous context of lies and misleadings, this could come across as just a fun way to see how the film was dramatized. However, with Tim's history of lying and OUR's shady past, it feels more like an opportunity for the organization to distance themselves from whatever he does next and any more disrepute he might throw on them. So that's who the film is based on, but what about everybody else? The script began being written in 2015, just 2 years into OUR's operations, which is pretty fast for a new nonprofit you'd think would be more focused on expanding its child trafficking support network, but no. Sound of Freedom was shot in 2018 before being dropped by Fox's South American distributor after the Disney-Fox merger and was delayed due to COVID. But the film's troubling path to the screen is actually the fault of big Hollywood, as lead star Jim Caviezel unsubtly infers at the film's conclusion.
The big studios control those, and the distributors have to decide whether or not, and this happened on The Passion of the Christ, whether to go and go where the people are.
Now, for those who don't know, Caviezel is a well-known conspiracist. In 2021, he appeared at a conservative health and wellness conference to promote The Sound of Freedom and mentioned QAnon conspiracies like adrenochrome harvesting, a very silly conspiracy based on the Hunter S. Thompson novel Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas that QAnon people have morphed into the idea that a satanic cabal of pedophiles is abducting children and stealing their adrenochrome to stay young. There's a great podcast episode by the QAnon Anonymous podcast detailing Jim's strange history of anti-Semitism, weird behavior, and violent outbursts from people who worked with him on the NBC show Person of Interest. Unsurprisingly, he's a very weird dude.
This is the best interview I've ever had in my life. I love your line of questioning and getting to what is real. I hooked into Tim, has a childlike quality to him, and I stay with that innocence, and don't take that innocence as weakness. When I read the scripture, I feel truth, good, evil, and I find the good, and let that just pierce the darkness.
Caviezel has been passionate about the film for years after becoming a virulent QAnon adherent, and has called this role as Tim Ballard the second most important he's taken, after Jesus in The Passion of the Christ. The production company and distributor, Angel Films, is a faith-based production company in Utah, the Mormon homeland, and picked up the film after Ballard met with them. And then the film was partially also bankrolled by Glenn Beck, who apparently had a part in the film that was cut out due to time. Glenn Beck is a has-been who once tried to take over the conservative media space with an attempted empire of film, books, and other assorted media. After he failed to get on the Trump train in 2016, he's kind of been left in the dust and is doing whatever he can to get back in the good graces of the mainstream conservative populace. Oh, and the movie's also been highly praised by known racist Mel Gibson, so there's that. So that's the basics of who's behind this movie and how it came to be. The lies of a grifting nonprofit founder turned into a tepid thriller that sat in a merger and was pushed to market by a faith film company and unhinged conspiracy theorists. I had to see how it turned out. So let's talk about the film itself, because like Ballard, the messages that this film promotes aren't just lies, they're potentially dangerous. I saw this film at a 3 o'clock showing on a Monday afternoon, and the theater was almost packed, almost 2 weeks after it opened. Before the first scene even rolls, we get the words "based on a true story," which is true in the same way Texas Chainsaw Massacre is based on the story of Ed Gein. It's a lie. It's a marketing ploy. It's about as true of a story as the Barbie movie, so go see that. The film opens with a harrowing scene of a brother and sister dropped off by their father for a casting call for a talent agent. Soon it's revealed the talent agent is kidnapping them. It's Honestly, a sickening scene on purpose, as images of smiling children fill the theater screen in first person. Soon after, we're introduced to DHS agent Tim Ballard. He takes down a pedophile before being inspired to try and take down a network of traffickers. The following scenes were full of bizarre lapses in logic, where Tim just took the pedophile out of his cell so he could gain his trust to go find more kids. He lets the pedophile go, and when he gets what he wants, as the pedophile is slammed into a diner tabletop crying, "I trusted you," Tim Ballard responds with the action hero line, "Never trust a pedophile?"
Just head to toe him back. And when you see this screaming down, get down on your knees and pray. I trusted you. Never trust a pedophile.
Which means that in this scene, Tim is also the pedophile. It's supposed to be a cool action line, but if you think about it for more than half a second, you realize what it says about Tim. Anyway, Tim finds the brother from the beginning of the film crossing the border with somebody claiming to be his uncle. This is based on the aforementioned arrest of Earl Van Buchanan. I've provided a link down below going further into detail on how these exploits are explicitly false, and Ballard only arrived on the scene afterwards. The boy in the film gives Tim a St. Timothy medallion given to him by his sister. Timothy is the saint of protecting children, or so the movie says. Upon actually researching, I found that Tim is apparently the saint of stomach problems. I can't make this up. So aside from that, we already have Tim being literally compared to a saint in a story that's already a lie. Cool.
Okay. Cool. No doubt.
After getting a teary plea from the boy's father, Tim decides to make finding the boy's sister his mission in life. He pleads with his commanding officer to go to Cartagena and track her down, kicking off a sequence of events loosely cobbled together from various OUR missions. To start, Tim attempts to go undercover as a pedo to drive out local traffickers. He allies with a kind-hearted former cartel leader who meets with the trafficker, where Tim asks for 50 kids. This reflects the actions OUR would take going to troubled areas and asking for young kids, and just like that, it seems to drive more trafficking in the film. The trafficker, who's fairly gay-coded by the way, with a thin frame, Freddie Mercury mustache, eyeliner, and earrings, responds by basically saying they'll need to get more kids, which doesn't seem to bother anybody. And why would Tim want these kids? Because his plan is to fake open a pedophile hotel brothel in a sting that will get the traffickers and the kids in one place for the feds to raid at once. This was loosely based on Operation Triple Take, which was the main focus of the documentary of the same name released in 2020. More than 120 kids were rescued, a higher number than the film's 50-ish. The victims in the film are all depicted as young children, but in reality, several were late teens or adults, and unlike the film, the real operation had cameras all over the place, evidenced by comparison shots at the staff roll during the end of the movie. Because in real life, Tim didn't go from working at DHS to being Rambo. He was already trying to put together his media image by the time the real operation took place. The sting based on trafficking kids also echoes Meg Conley's story of an OUR raid where kids had been trafficked for the very first time because of Tim's request and were later released without any help. We then get a self-aggrandizing scene with kids singing and dancing after the raid, where the former cartel boss says to Tim, "That's the sound of freedom," a cheesy line apparently based on something a real operator said to Tim during the raid, hence the title of the film. However, I doubt it, because just knowing Tim. And finally, we have the climax of the film, because like in real life, where Ballard uses intel like psychic mediums, the Ballard in the movies, intel was shoddy, and the girl isn't in the group that gets trafficked. The girl is all but forgotten as Tim's heroics take center stage for most of the movie, and it's later revealed she was bought by a local rebel militia leader. The next section is loosely based on the horrible practice of impersonating doctors that OUR and various other organizations have been criticized for. In the movie, Tim goes upriver and is taken hostage under the guise of delivering vaccines to people in need. He finds the girl, kills the militia leader in one of the worst shot and most confusing action sequences this side of Iron Fist, and escapes under gunfire. Which should leave the audience to wonder, what happened to the dozens of other children in that camp? What about any outbreaks that may happen because doctors or aid workers are now no longer let in the area? Doesn't matter. Tim is the hero. He returns home to his family. The girl is back in her family home. Roll credits. Until 2 minutes in, when Jim Caviezel pops up to thank everyone for watching. He depicts the film as some sort of brave act of truth-telling by insinuating big studios in Hollywood didn't want it to be seen. A small aside and dog whistle, I'm sure, is red meat to the QAnon-adjacent audience he's been catering to. Finally, Caviezel ends by saying real heroes aren't Tim or himself. Tim, of course, being literally depicted as a saint driven by God to save kids. He says instead the real heroes of the story are the kids and who they represent. To remind you, the brother and sister are basically completely fictionalized from over a decade of Tim's career. You're then given a QR code that audiences can scan, which defaults to a $75 donation to Angel Studios for buying more tickets for people to go see the movie for free. This style of pass-it-on advertising isn't uncommon with evangelical films, which often encourage bringing church groups and stuff like that. However, this is a unique program in that while you might think at first blush it's for charity, because Jim Caviezel says this is to help the kids, however, all intents seem to point towards Angel Studios just keeping the money like you were buying a regular movie ticket. The end of this movie pitches the act of watching the film as a way to help kids in and of itself. So by buying tickets for others to see it, you're spreading awareness of an important issue. But are you? No, not really, because in addition to being based on lies, Sound of Freedom is a deeply predatory film that doesn't put victims or their experiences first, instead appealing to the pseudo-vigilante power fantasy that Ballard has been playing up for 10 years. It should be unsurprising by now that the actual experts in human trafficking don't agree with Tim's tactics. In a 2022 report from the US Department of State, it's attested that human trafficking combat efforts are most effective when perpetrated by those who have been victims, something Tim doesn't do. He doesn't center their experiences or their expertise at all. In a Rolling Stone interview, Aaron Albrecht, an anti-trafficking attorney with 15 years of experience, says, quote, grounded in this sensational perspective of what child trafficking would be rather than reflecting its grim reality when talking of The Sound of Freedom. See, The Sound of Freedom wants to be an action thriller and a grounded true story, but doesn't want to tackle the difficult aspects of trafficking head on. So all we're left with is paper-thin stereotypes. All the pedophiles and traffickers are depicted as sleazy greaseball perverts. This is standard operating procedures for action flicks like Taken, but it's not realistic. The reality is that more often than not, sexual slavers and traffickers can look just like everyone else. While the film wants to push a not-so-subtle conspiracy-adjacent take that traffickers run in networks with talent agencies and production companies, more often than not, children are trafficked by someone they know, as indicated by these 2021 statistics from Polaris, an anti-trafficking organization. Polaris states, using data from the National Trafficking Prevention Hotline, that 33% of trafficking victims are trafficked from a relative, with an additional 28% from an intimate partner. That's more than 60% of estimated trafficking victims. And while that's just one sample group, it remains a far cry from the film's flat depiction of traffickers as sleazy back alley pimps and sudden kidnappers. And in the process, with everything attesting to the film's accuracy for its evangelical and probably well-meaning audience.
I see a lot of films at the beginning, it says, based on a true story. This film is the true story. And I have the privilege of being one of the many executive producers of this film, but I'm here to share it with you because it is a mission for all of us to reach more people.
That means the grim reality of human trafficking and sex abuse can go unrecognized. The real horror behind people who perpetuate these crimes against humanity isn't that it's happening somewhere nebulous in the world in some South American country. It's that it's happening to someone you may know, or even worse, you may even know somebody responsible for it. Training people to think this way is training them to not realize that and not see very real problems when they could be happening right in front of them. You can check out the links to Polaris's website and the stats down below. The depiction of children in the film is also questionable, like the aforementioned opening scene, which shows children being poised and given makeup in first person. The background music gives the impression that something grim and foreboding is happening, but the filmmakers still decide to shoot the scene from the POV of how these kids are presented to pedophiles. This isn't the first time the film lets pedophiles or traffickers' point of view take center stage either. It drives home the idea of how slimy and gross these people are, which is fair enough, But the film does so at the expense of the victims, and it comes across as voyeuristic. I don't think any anti-pedophile movie should ever be full of scenes that a pedophile might enjoy. Yet, here they are, basically sharing the POV with the audience. Gross. Even worse, the movie treats all of the children horribly. The only qualities these characters get are to be sexual assault fodder, as the audience is shown several scenes with gross adult men caressing a 10-year-old girl's cheek, a panicked little girl staring into the middle distance as a drunk man unbuttons his pants, and the aftermath of an encounter as a little girl sits alone in a bathtub with a bloody lip crying. The film puts more effort into characterizing its various slimeball traffickers and pedophiles than it does the children they victimize. The biggest moment the kids get is when they all gather around and sing, which is just a vehicle for Tim Ballard's stupid anecdote about the sound of freedom. The victims aren't front and center here. The primary emotions we see from them are horror as they're abused, dragged around, screaming and crying. And props to the kids, honestly, because many of these scenes are impressively acted, making for some truly distressing material. But the main purpose these scenes serve isn't to give the characters depth or highlight the bravery and fortitude of survivors who go through this horrifying ideal. All of this is to give Tim, the saint-like hero, motivation to keep going. To say nothing of how boring this movie is as Tim plods through his poorly thought out plans, much like in real life, I guess. As I sat and watched this exploitative mess take the stories of real survivors and victims and turn them into an imitation Taken, it occurred to me, Sound of Freedom is just Christian Saw. Like, this movie is just evangelical torture porn, where you get to watch a series of horrific vignettes of fictionalized human suffering, feel a little dirty, and go back to your regular life as if you've experienced something harrowing. But you didn't. Then there are the methods Tim uses, based on real life, where his efforts have been proven, as I mentioned before, to worsen demand for trafficking in high-risk areas. However, according to the Rolling Stone article I just mentioned, these raids and ops aren't how a majority of trafficking victims are helped. Trafficking victims may undergo psychological training to be more attached to their captors. They may undergo subtle coercion that can be hard to spot. They also need to be set up with support networks and homes and jobs and therapy and other tools to help them return to a normal life. None of which Tim or OUR seems to be interested in doing. And none of them is shown in the film as a result. Because this movie is trying to sell a fantasy of a lone, brave soldier driven by steadfast conviction in what's right. It's not a bad fantasy, and if it were just another action movie, like Taken, probably nobody would care. The problem is that this mediocre action movie is selling itself as a grim, true story, a hard look at the reality of trafficking, and even worse, it's using that false label of truth to rake in cash from regular people who have no idea how much they're being lied to. But here's the thing. Like the Wayfair conspiracy, I don't blame regular people for praising the movie. If you were to walk into this film only knowing what it was about, I think most people would walk out having been affected. For Ma and Pa Kettle Evangelical, the middle-aged white audience this is squarely aimed at, this must feel like Cannibal Holocaust. It's normal that your parents and grandparents are shocked by this thing that they don't regularly think about or come into contact with. But supporting this film and continuing to support it isn't helping anybody except the money-hungry profiteers who made it. The Sound of Freedom is a lie. It is based on the lie of a sensationalist grifter who's been trying to get a more profitable spotlight on his operations for a decade. It's the product of conspiracists and political provocateurs looking to push an agenda. As a film, it exploits those who it claims to want to help while giving an audience an ill-informed idea of what human trafficking and child abuse really looks like. And even worse, people will walk out of the theater thinking it was all real. Don't listen to this. Do your own research, because human trafficking is a very real issue. And nobody is going to be helped by listening to lies like this. Hey there, and thank you for watching. I realize this is now my third political video in a row. But I have another shooter video in the works coming soon, so please look forward to that. If you don't know, I'm also trying to make a go at full-time content creation. So if you've enjoyed my content, whether it's my writing, my videos, my cosplay, photography, or even my other channel, please consider giving a few dollars to get listed alongside these fine people here and get all sorts of fun patron benefits. On that note, I'd like to thank everybody for sticking with me as I made this video. There was a lot to research and get through, and I had to put on pause because a hate church preached a sermon about me. Anyway, I hope it was useful as always, and as always, thank you very much for watching and have a great day.